Uh,
All
let me
right.
get my
Hello and
slides going. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no problem. And hello and welcome to Real Seekers. I'm here with Guy Powell as he's putting up his slides for his fourth and final presentation on the historicity of the Shroud of Turin and looking at things like the art history and how the shroud fits into some of the historical documents that we have. Guys, you're trying to bring up your slides there. Just how have you been since the last couple of weeks you were on the show?
Oh, fantastic. It's been a great time, and definitely we're getting ready for Easter and Palm Sunday coming up, so couldn't be better.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, Easter is always a great time of the year. One of my favorites is because my birthday is around the same time. So yeah, yeah.
Oh, well, fantastic. Well, almost happy birthday then. I
Thank you very
am
much.
having trouble, however, getting my slides up. So I
Okay.
guess I can do share screen and there we go. Okay, that's what's going on here. There we go. That's this one. All right, very good. Can you see that?
Yep, it's popping up now. And if you
All
go to
right.
full screen, so yeah.
Yep, there we go.
All right, over to you for your presentation and for the audience. As we go throughout, if you have questions for Guy, hopefully related to what he's presenting, but if you have questions, we'll raise them throughout the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, feel free to if you have a question about the shroud generally or about then obviously the content, then glad to talk through that. So what we've been talking about in the last few sessions has been what I call tracing the origins, and what that means is we're as a historian, as an amateur historian, what I'm trying to do is find evidence for, in particular, a relic or a possible relic called the image of Edessa. Now, the image of Edessa, for many shroud authenticists, is they believe that the image of Edessa is the shroud. So what that means is that um, the shroud, the burial shroud of Jesus Christ, was moved from Jerusalem, obviously from the tomb, potentially up to Antioch, potentially up to Edessa, which is in eastern Turkey, and then potentially up to Constantinople, and then from Constantinople. There's reasonable documentation. And by the way, that's what we're going to focus in on here this afternoon. But in any case, that's why it's called the image of Edessa. And then about 944 AD, it started to be called the Mandylion. And what I'm going to do is just a couple of few slides to kind of review what we've already talked about. And then what I'd like to do this time is talk about what I call the inventories. And the inventories are the relic inventories of the various kings in France over the time period from roughly 1240s or so up to about actually 1793 in the French Revolution. Now, technically, I'm really only interested in about 1350, when the Shroud of Turin first appeared in a documented way, and documented is the key word there, in a documented way in Lille, France, in a small church, and where then, as I said, it's a documented, and then the history since then and the provenance since then is pretty straightforward. But nevertheless, there's some interesting things that go past that all the way up until the French Revolution in 1793. So, just as a quick review, um, and actually this applies to everything, but in the world of the shroud, the Mandylion, or any other of the real or supposed artifacts and relics, there is nothing 100% certain, and that is pretty critical. I'm trying to remember what I had for dinner last night, let alone figuring out what someone wrote about their experience, or something historical 2,000 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, when the shroud was somewhere, wherever it was. And so we have to be very careful when we're looking at historical sources, in that they may or may not be 100% accurate for all good reasons, some bad, but mostly good reasons. And so when we're doing historical studies, we have to really take that into account. And what do we want to believe more than something else that we might want to believe less? And today, then, what we're going to talk about is a pretty important question for the Shroud authenticists. Probably about 50% believe that the Shroud is one and the same with the Mandylion, and about 50% say no, 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 those are two separate relics. And I kind of lean towards the two separate relics. Although, it's not 100% even in my own mind. It could be maybe 90%, 80% that they are not one and the same, and 10 or 20% that they are one and the same. And we've kind of talked about some of the early history that lends itself to supporting that hypothesis. And then there's the later history, which we're going to talk about, which are these, what I call the inventories, and we'll talk about those. Those also support, in my opinion, generally, that the Shroud and the Mandylion are not one and the same. And so, we talked about where Edessa was. We talked about the where it went. So whether it went in the blue line from Jerusalem through Antioch up to Constantinople, or the red line where it took a right-hand turn and went to Edessa and stayed there, and then went to Constantinople. And then afterwards, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit today, is then this green line and some of the other evidence that takes place after the Fourth Crusade, which is 1204, and in particular around the 1230s, 1240s, when the Mandylion and or the Shroud, depending upon what your opinion is, moved from Constantinople either to Athens in my green line here, or potentially to Paris. Okay, so and as I mentioned last time, there's a bunch with historical documents. I'm not going to review that today, but generally, even though you have a document, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% believable, 100% certain. It takes a lot of other things that need to be looked at to be able to, make sure that what you're looking at is really good evidence. So, what is really pretty critical, as we've talked about, just as a quick review, is the different time periods. And what's fascinating to me is these time periods have different evidence as to where the Shroud was. And for me, I would most likely want to look at what the early evidence is. So from the resurrection to roughly the 300s, and there the evidence, in my mind, clearly points to no mention of what's called the image of Edessa. And therefore, if that's the case, then the Shroud is definitely not one and the same with the image of Edessa. The image of Edessa came later and was then created after the 300s. Then we have the fourth century to the iconoclasm. There's some interesting things going on there, where all of a sudden some hints start to come up where there is an image of Edessa, number one, and then number two, that image of Edessa is sometimes conflated with the Shroud, and as being a miraculous image. And then the iconoclasm, the breaking of images, the iconoclasm. And that's when the patriarch actually the emperor, and some of the religious side of things in Constantinople, we're saying that, we want to follow the second um, the second commandment, and that we should not have any graven images. So they were actually going out and burning, breaking, destroying images throughout the eastern part of the Christian world. And now it didn't affect the Western world, so it didn't affect Italy and Rome and Europe as much. It really only affected the eastern side, and there was clearly a split as well at that time between the Eastern religions, the Orthodox religions, as we might now think of them, as opposed to the Roman Catholic religions. Now, then there's the 900s, when a relic, an image, which many people believe was the image of Edessa as the shroud, was then moved and transported, translated is the term, from Edessa in eastern Turkey to Constantinople. And so that's a pretty controversial time, because there are references that people saw blood on that image, and if there's blood on that image, then that would be tend to point to it being the shroud. If there was no blood, or if there was some confusion about the blood, then that would tend to uh, uh, affect the evidence and how we understand that evidence as it relates to our hypothesis as to whether the shroud and the Mandylion are one and the same. So we go to the end of the 12th century. I think we've already talked about that. Then we have the Fourth Crusade. That's when the Europeans and the northern Christians, the Latin Christians, as they were often called, they basically destroyed, plundered, raped, and pillaged the city of Constantinople, stole relics like you wouldn't believe, took gold and silver. And as a matter of fact, if any of you have been to what's the city there in Italy, in Venice. In Venice, there's this beautiful church, and that beautiful church has 4 bronze horses, life-size horses, and those horses were stolen from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, and they're still there in Venice. Now we're going to talk about roughly right after the Fourth Crusade through the French Revolution today, and go from there. So now, just continuing on in our review, the Mandylion, and this is kind of an interesting point to me, is the Mandylion derives from a word, mandil or mantilla or mantele, and that word really references a small towel or napkin, a relatively small cloth, not a big cloth, not something that's the size of the shroud, 14 and a half meters by 14 and a half feet by 3.5 feet. It references a small cloth. So why would anyone in that time period call it a small cloth as opposed to a big cloth or a folded up big cloth? They could have used a different term. And so it's kind of interesting that that term came to life in 944 in reference to this relic called the Mandylion, and that is totally incongruent with the size of the shroud cloth being 14 and a half feet by 3.5 feet. Then we talked about the first to the third centuries. We talked about the sixth to the ninth, to the 10th to the 12th. And one of the things that really started me on this, and I think this has some interesting connotations, and I've shown these images in the past, but just to bring them back, as you look at these images, the one on the left is possibly the way that, if you thought that the Shroud of Turin and the Mandylion or the image of Edessa were one and the same, you would see the face of the image of the man in the shroud, and then surrounded by a gold tablet, or a gold plated tablet where that image was mounted. And then that image then was copied across the centuries, the earliest one being in AD 600 in the Anka icon. And then you have some that are later. Some of these look very similar to this Anka icon, and so this they could be. But if you look at these images have some of the traits of the shroud, and some of the traits that are in here are not what you'd see in the shroud. And so then here we are. Let me just make sure I'm going correctly here. Yep, we are. So let's talk then about a little more detail on the 900s to the 12th century. And I think there's 2 things I wanted to kind of review here before we go into it. So there's a guy, he was called Skylitz, Johannes Skylitz is, depending upon the language you want to use, and he put together an illustrated history of Christianity, basically, and of the, well, not of Christianity only, but of the happenings in the Roman Empire, based out of Constantinople. And one event in particular is this translation, as it's called, of the image of Edessa from Edessa over to Constantinople. And so we see the image with a face on it. But what's interesting, you can really see the in black and white here, and I've put over it kind of the edges of that image as it was being translated from the king of Edessa over and given to the folks that were going to translate it over to Constantinople. And you can see it has fringes on it. Well, there are no fringes on the shroud, number one. Number two, there's no evidence that there were any fringes on it, that they would have to be like little pinholes or something like that. And if you also notice, there's two little black lines here on the edges, and those don't appear anywhere on the shroud. So in this particular understanding of the time by this gentleman, Sky Litzes, he basically is drawing an illustration here where he is thinking that the Mandylion, or the image of Edessa, is a small cloth Mandylion, and has an image on it, maybe painted, maybe not. In this case, it's certainly in color, and it looks like he would have interpreted it as being in color, and therefore a painted portrait, therefore not the shroud. The shroud is definitely sepia toned and what have you. Now, there's another.
Oh,
Go
just
ahead.
a question on the last slide, with the skylights. Yes. I'm just kind of curious, what's your take? Because I have had Pam Moon on my show, and she will argue, well, this is actually proof that it's talking about a long shroud cloth, and she'll point to the pink cloth as part, I guess, as part of it. Do you know, like, what is Pam Moon? How does she try to argue that this is actually the image of Edessa, which was the Shroud of Turin?
Yeah,
Uh,
thank you for that. Yeah, exactly. So she would argue that if you look at this pink cloth here, it looks like a long cloth. It looks like it potentially is 2.5 meters long, and, I mean, 14 feet long. It's a big thing. Now, there's a couple of things that I interpret. I could be right or wrong, but I interpret, first of all, that the color of that cloth is different than what's here. So this cloth is here, in my opinion, here so that you don't actually touch this holy relic. You're touching the cloth underneath it, and this is what wrapped that very valuable relic, the Mandylion, or what they believe to be then the Mandylion, and which they believe to be also a holy creation from Jesus. Now, what's interesting is, if you take another look at this image, so the legend of Edessa says that Jesus wrote a letter to Apgar, and some people believe then there was also an image with it. Some people believe there was just the letter. If you go back all the way to the 300s, the resurrection time period to the 300s, they only talk about the letter. They don't even talk about any portrait at all. So there is, with high probability, a holy letter of sorts that potentially Jesus wrote, or was dictated to him and then transcribed by him and written in him. And one of the things you see underneath that letter, so that's that white little box here, this little rectangle, and underneath that letter is a long pink cloth. And it's funny because it's almost folded exactly the same way as this image is on the surrender of the Holy Mandylion. And so, if that's the case, what's going on in Sky Litzes is interpreting how the letter would have been carried in their hands, but the actual relic would be protected by having it placed in a cloth. And there's actually a third image where some other relics are being brought in a gold chest, and that one also has a pink cloth under it. So I would more or less argue against Pam Moon, who I like. I mean, she's done some really great stuff, but I would argue that the pink cloth is not the shroud. It is only a cloth to protect the relic from the hands of those people carrying it. Yeah,
Makes
thank you
sense.
for that question.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks so much.
Okay, so let's see here. So we went through the image of Edessa. We went through that already. All right, so now the Fourth Crusade. So, and this is really where it gets kind of interesting. So the Fourth Crusade um, kind of took place, around 1203. The armies arrived, the Latin armies arrived in Constantinople, outside of Constantinople, actually in 1203. And but then what was supposed to happen was that the emperor was supposed to provide them funding so that they could go on to Jerusalem and conquer the city or retake the city in Jerusalem, so it would now be Latin as opposed to Muslim. Alexios, he reneged on that promise, and now all of a sudden these crusaders were on their way, and they had no money, and they owed money to the Venetians, who provided them all of the ships. So as you can imagine, when from Venice, and it's really funny, we think of of Henry Ford being the first production line, the first manufacturer using a production line. That is not so. The Venetians actually had a production line building ships, building boats. And so what happened was the Venetians built boats, financed boats, loaned them, so to speak, to the Crusaders. And Alexios, who was the emperor at the time in Constantinople, was then supposed to pay them back. He reneged. And so the Crusaders, the Latins came in and said, "Well, if you're going to renege, we're just going to come in and steal and take over." So they basically were outside the city in 1203. Alexios reneges in 1204, and they just rampage, pillage, rape, steal, you name it. They took everything. The riches that were taken, the gold and silver, everything that was there was taken. Most of it was melted down. The jewels, who knows what happened to them, but the riches were just incredible. And of course, you have then the Christian relics, and the storehouse of the Christian relics owned by the emperor were just incredible. He went out and actually Helen, going back to the 300s, she went out to Jerusalem and just started collecting relics left and right. And they at the time had probably, well, definitely the biggest storehouse of relics, of Christian relics, in the world, an enormous storehouse. And so then some of the relics were destroyed, some of them were stolen, some of them were damaged or whatever. And so all of a sudden, at that point, then the knowledge and the whereabouts of the shroud are uncertain. Now, the shroud was held in a church called Saint Mary of Blachernay, which is in the northeast of Constantinople, and it was kind of going to be the new chapel and the new palace for the emperor, but he never really got to finish it. So the old palace was called the Bucolian Palace, which means bull lion, Bucolian, bull lion. And the emperor then was in the palace, and he then, well, actually, he the Fourth Crusade, he actually then had to escape. But in the Grand Pharaoh's Chapel, the Chapel of Light at the palace, is where most references to the Mandylion say that it was housed. And as a matter of fact, just last night and this weekend, I've been working on some new papers, and there's about 6 different references where they say the shroud is in the St. Mary's of Blachernay Church, and the Mandylion is in the Pharaoh's chapel in the Bucolian Palace. So they're actually saying that they've seen both items, and they know that one is here and one is there. So kind of interesting, and kind of an interesting proof that the two items are two separate items. Okay, so we talked about the Fourth Crusade. We talked about a handful of things.
With
Last
just out of curiosity, those six things, are you about to present those, or do you, if you're not going to mention them, do you want to just mention a few of them so we know what you're?
oh,
Yeah,
yeah, no, I wasn't. I'm not ready to present them, not because I don't want to, but I haven't finalized you have to translate the Greek or the Latin over to English, and then you got to write it up, and you just need to be 100% certain that you're getting it right. But one of them, for example, is who was it? It was he was actually a an Icelandic person, traveled down to Constantinople, and his name was yeah. You see this, I don't have it I don't have it ready to present, but he was an Icelandic, and he actually says, "Hey, the Mandalian is over here in the Pharaoh's chapel. The shroud is over there in the St. Mary's chapel, and this is roughly 1150." So in the late 1100s, there are five or six different mentions. The next one is Constantin Stilbes, I think it was, and he says, hey, here's the Mandilion. It is in this chapel. He doesn't mention the shroud, but here's the Mandilion. It's in this chapel, in the Pharaoh's chapel, and then there's a couple of others, and I apologize, I don't have the names, and I don't have it ready to present here yet.
no problem. Just wanted to ask to get a feeling. So yeah, I'll let you
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's so funny. I've been working with, well, not working with. He sent me a couple of papers. This guy Pierre de Riedmertin. I think that's how you pronounce his name, and he's been so friendly and so helpful. He's based in France, and I think he's the president of the French Shroud Association. Now, he believes that the Shroud and the Mendelian are one and the same, and he said, "Hey, guy, check out a couple of these sources," and he used them in a couple of his papers, and now I go back to not the paper that he sent me, but I go to the sources of that paper, and I go to the which are maybe, let's say, 100 years old, and then let's say in the 1860s, 1870s, and then I go to the sources of those papers, which are the original writings in Latin or in Greek about these different individuals. So I'm going as far back to the original sources as I can to then interpret them and then add them to my evidence list, and I'm picking out, and actually the one source that he gave me, it's called the Exuviae Sacrae Constantinopolae, and it's actually got some really good sources of evidence of the shroud as well. So these writers, and the same ones, they say, I saw the shroud in 1150. I saw the shroud in 1190 in Constantinople. So those are further evidences, in addition to Robert de Clary as saying in writing that the shroud existed in Constantinople in the 1100s. All right, so the inventories. I call them the inventories. I don't know if there's a better name for them, but I just think it's just so fascinating. It's when we own a business, and where you have, let's say, a store, and every month, or and you even see a Home Depot or Lowe's, they know up to the minute what the inventory is in each and every one of their stores. So they know how many nuts and bolts and hammers and brooms and drills. I mean, they know all of that stuff. And you don't think about that there might be an inventory of the relics, and so that's what this is. And so I'm going to go through these here. And I apologize. Let me just get rid of that yellow thing there, just to make this easy. And so what happened in, I think it was 1237, was there was an agreement by the then Latin emperor of Constantinople, or Byzantium, and that agreement was between him and King Louis. I think it was the ninth in Paris, that he wanted to trade some of these incredibly valuable relics that were not stolen in the Fourth Crusade, and he wanted to trade them for money. So the Fourth Crusade is such a seminal event. The Fourth Crusade basically bankrupted Constantinople. And so here we have the new emperor, the Latin emperor of Istanbul, of Constantinople, and he's broke and he needs money. So he's thinking of ways to gain, to make money. And one of them is to sell off your assets. So he wanted to sell off all of these relics that he had, and he had, I think it's 21 relics altogether. And these there's actual writings that you can see where each of the items are listed off and described in maybe a sentence, maybe less, couple of words as to what they are. And there's two items that I want to talk about. One of them is item 8 in the original list, and the other one is item 16, which we'll talk about. So this one here is item 8, and this inventory is from Gerard of Saint Quentin Lille Translatio, and basically in Latin is the what he wrote, and it's translated into English, which is a certain table, which, when the Lord was taken down from the cross, his face touched. So, two things. Now, in my opinion, this is the conflation of item 8, where there's a wooden tablet that has potentially a cross in it, and his face touched it. So that could be the face that's on the shroud, or it could be the face that's on the mandilion. Now, if we go back to our last presentation, Constantine, the emperor at the time, who then in 944, he says two things. He received a cloth in a table, a gilded table with jewels on it. And so he could be referencing this. It could be, that picture that I had on the left with the question mark on it. It could be the shroud inside that table, inside that golden framed, gilded frame with jewels on it. It could be that he was talking about that. It could be also that this person that wrote this, saw the mandilion, which the mandilion legend is that Jesus' face touched it, and then generated this image, or it could have been a painted image, as those 6 or 7 images like I talked about, as including the Anka icon. So that's the first one. That's item 8. That's item 8 of about 21 items.
Guy, just before you move on, we do have an audience question. If you want to address
absolutely.
that. Uh-huh. So this comes from someone new. I don't think this person's asked before, but I fish in a tie, saying, do the Crusaders ever say where specifically in Jerusalem the shroud came?
No. Interesting question, though. And it's an interesting. So there's a couple of problems here with the Crusaders and the shroud, and and the relics that were taken in during the Fourth Crusade. And if I go back here, so the relics were taken, and this guy Theodore Angelos Komnenos, he was a brother of the then emperor, and he basically sends a letter to the Pope in the West, because the Pope was the one that instigated the Crusades, and he's the one that instigated the Fourth Crusade. And so he sends a letter and says, hey, all of our relics were taken, including the linen in which our Lord Jesus was wrapped after his death and before the resurrection. And he's saying, you've got to do something. You've got to tell those Crusaders, to give that thing back. So now so the Pope then issues a bull, a papal bull, and says, if you have any of these stolen relics, and then you better give them back or you're going to be excommunicated. And there's more to it, of course, but nobody back then would want to be excommunicated. Excommunication, is one of the worst kind of punishments for a Christian. And these crusaders were, very Christian, and that would be a disaster. So those crusaders didn't want anybody to know what kind of relics they had. So, in answer to your question, then, of course, if they didn't want anybody to know what they had stolen, then they're not going to say, well, this is one that came from Jerusalem. And certainly, many of these crusaders may have never even been in Jerusalem to even know that. They would only know, potentially, like this one. So Theodore Angelus Komnenos, he, he's basically, he knows that, the Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped, in the tomb in Jerusalem. So he would know that this came from Jerusalem. But whether the Crusaders did or whatever, they would not want to, they would not want to say anything about it. And that actually has some interesting modern implications as well. And if we get a chance to talk about it, we will.
Sounds good. Perfect. Yeah, thank you for addressing that question. So, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. All right, so we have the this initial writing, which is kind of, this is what I'm sending you. This of Gerard of Saint Quentin and Lille, and then we have Baldwin the Second, in 1247. So we have 1241 and now 1247. So it's kind of like this Gerard. He then tells King Louis, "Hey, here's what we got. What do you want?" And then they agree, and he said, "Oh, I want everything, and here's 20 billion whatevers, and here's what I'm going to do to pay for it." Now, Baldwin the Second, he was the emperor at the time of the of Constantinople, and so his inventory in 1247, so 6 years later, says there is a holy cloth inserted in a table. So, is that the full cloth? Is that the full cloth of the shroud folded up like a tetradiplon, folded, in four and then in two? Is that a 14 and a half foot cloth by a 3.5 foot, and, folded up into something kind of a landscape or maybe portrait mode, kind of like what we have in the Anka icon? And so he believes there's a cloth inside there. Then we get, and all of these inventories are labeled by this guy, Vidier. He's the one that did all the research of the inventories of the items that are in the Grand Chasse, the big cabinet inside the Sainte-Chapelle Cathedral. And that was built specifically by King Louis to house all of these, incredible relics. So now inventory A, the all of these relics have now been transferred over to Paris. They're now in Paris. They're now in the Grand Chasse, and there's an inventory, the first inventory that Vidier could find, and this one was done sometime around 1279, maybe as late as 1350. 1315. So we're looking at maybe 30 years to 60 years later. And here we're talking about a painted oak case where there is a large sanctuary without writing. So so what that means is there's something there. The wooden case is a reliquary, and it's a painted box, and there's something unidentified inside. Now, what's interesting is, why didn't they open it up? What's going on here? Why didn't they open it up? Now, this, by the way, so I have it originally as item 8. Now this is labeled as item 11, and the numbers change here as we move forward, but just to kind of keep things moving forward. So inventory A, the next one, what's just called the Barry sequencer, he goes out and he only says, "Hey, there's some kind of a tablet in the Grand Chasse." And that's then somewhere 1250 to 60. Then we have inventory L, and this inventory L takes place now 300 years later. And there's a couple of other ones that I'm not showing here, but there's a holy canvas inserted in a table. And what's fascinating about that is that that's 1534. So there is a cloth, it's in a table, and if he writes it as a cloth, that kind of means that he actually saw the cloth. Now, who knows? He could have been referencing a past inventory, because this is inventory L. There's a whole bunch in between that. And but in 1534, we have documented evidence that at that time, that's roughly the time when the Duke of Savoy purchased the shroud, the Holy Shroud, from Marguerite de Charnay, from France. And so, how can the shroud be in two places at once? The shroud was being exhibited through these things called exhibitions, in the Liray Church from roughly 1354. And here we then have an inventory L, an item related to holy canvas inserted in the table. Well, the shroud can't be in both places at the same time. The shroud is very well documented from 1350s all the way up to modern times. And so then this has to be a separate item. And this item then relates all the way back to item 8 from the original inventory. So all of these things, a holy cloth inserted in the table, well, that could be the Mandylion. It's a holy cloth. A certain table when the Lord was taken down from the cloth, his face touched. Well, that one is probably not true. It's not the image from his face when he was taken down from the cross. It has to be something else. So even then, and early on, I said, well, the histories, you can't even, you have to really, try and interpret the histories and what they wrote, and then you have to make a decision as to whether you want to put more weight or less weight on when the Lord was taken down from the cross, his face touched. And so this is from 1241, so that's roughly 1,200 years after the resurrection and the creation of that image on the shroud cloth. Okay, so those are the inventories of what has been labeled the Mandylion in modern times, that are now have been transferred from Constantinople to Paris. They're now in the Grand Chasse, in the Grand in the Sainte Chapelle, and I'm going to show you some pictures of those in a minute. Okay, so the Liray extensions, as I mentioned, started in the 1350s. 1355 is kind of the date everybody hones in on there. And then there's another one, 1534, inventory M, and this now is now called the Veronica. Now that's kind of interesting, because there is a relic that's in Rome that's now called the Veronica, that kind of magically appears as the veil of Veronica, which is a cloth that a woman gave to Jesus to wipe his face while he was carrying the cross on the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. And so now they've changed the name, La Veronique, and so the Veronica, but it's related to exactly the same item. And here it says, where there is a fault of 10 stones. So there's been, if we look back at that image where we had the face of the Anka icon, or the face of the man in the shroud, surrounded by gold in a gilded kind of a frame, a gilded kind of a table, and there were jewels on it. And now all of a sudden there are 10 jewels missing. So somebody possibly stole those 10 jewels off of that holy table. Just fascinating. Okay, now let's look at another item, and that's item 16. And so in these inventories of the 21 items, we had item 8, which was basically now thought of as being the Mandylion. We have item 16, which is identified as the shroud, or in particular a part of the shroud, a piece of the shroud. And so we go through the same story of each and every one of those inventories. I've added a couple where it's brought out a little bit further with inventory O and inventory R, inventory CC, and all of these were written up and researched by this guy Vidier, and just fascinating. So here, this item 16 starts out as from Gerard. There was also a part of a certain shroud in which the body of Christ placed in the tomb was wrapped. Well, that description is kind of similar, even though this is a separate item from the item 8, a certain table, which when the Lord was taken down, his face touched. So he's now somehow conflating things there. And so we have to kind of realize that, this is maybe the shroud, maybe he is talking about the shroud, because I have some more details here in a minute. Or he's talking about this being a part of the certain shroud. So this is potentially one of the corners that were cut off of the shroud. So if we follow that further down in the various inventories, and then the active session by Baldwin.
Because I just wanted to jump in, yeah, because I wanted to clarify that, because obviously some of these inventories are obviously quite late, 1500s, 1700s, and stuff like that. And if they're mentioning the shroud, how is we know the Shroud of Turin is in Leary by 1355, kind of thing. So how is the isn't that a contradiction? I guess what you're saying is part of the shroud would have remained in this reliquary or something, and the
Well,
rest, yeah,
yeah, and hold that thought, because that's two things. One of them is that over here with the Mandelian item 8, how could if they're talking about a holy cloth inserted in a table in 1534, that cloth cannot be the shroud, because we know the holy shroud is in Liray at that time. And is about to be, about to be sold to from Marguerite de Charnay over to sold to the Duke of Savoy. But hold that thought on what you're talking about there.
no problem.
So,
Okay,
all right, so here we have a part of a certain shroud. So it could have been a piece of the shroud. It could be a corner of the shroud or something. And we have more details on that coming up, and we'll talk about that. But that part of the shroud, and then here it's saying the whole shroud. So the Sudarium, in the Barry sequencer, here he's using the word Sudarium, which means shroud, and so it's kind of written down as the shroud, but later on it's the part of the shroud. Here, then we have the Holy Shroud, to which there is no fault, and it's and so how do you relate these two as being one being a part of the shroud and the other being the whole shroud, and then we have and here we have and I don't know how to pronounce this one, Linku, I think it is, and and that's then kind of referencing the whole thing, but that's in 1534. 1534. It can't be the whole shroud. It has to be either a piece or it has to be something else. So, because we know that by 1534, the shroud was in Liray, or it was about to be sold to the Duke of Savoy. Then we have the Sindon Domine. So the Sindon Domine, Sindon is then another word for the Holy Shroud. And then the Sindon Domini means the Holy Shroud of God. And so here, we keep going for these inventories on either the part of the shroud early on or the whole shroud. Now, it may have been that this item was inside somewhere and they didn't look. They just said, "Up there it is." They didn't look closely, and so then they wrote down Holy Shroud or Lucindon Domini Unia fault, without any faults. And then we have the Holy Shroud, the Holy Shroud, the Holy Shroud, and all of these inventories later on, from 1740 and then all the way to 1791. And then the inventories unfortunately stop. All of those relics are now either stolen, destroyed, burned, or what have you. And because the French Revolution was in 1793, and if you'll notice as well, the inventory DD is in the Abbey of Saint Denis, and the Saint Denis church is where I can't remember which king it was, Louis the 14th maybe, or I don't know, 16th, and he then moved all of the relics from the Saint Chapelle over to the Saint Denis church to keep them safer. Well, it didn't work. Okay, so this is the current inside of the Saint Chapelle in Paris. Beautiful church, and the stained glass windows are incredible. And the funny part is it's totally empty. And back here in the middle is where the Grande Chasse would have been. And it's funny. I've been there, and I've been to the Saint Denis Church, and these churches, these are just absolutely beautiful. Now, unfortunately, the Grand Chasse was itself very valuable, so it was stolen and melted down and destroyed, unfortunately. And it had all of these different relics in it, and two different people. The gentleman here on the left, and I can't remember who it was, but and the guy on the right. Oh, so this one is from Savour Jérôme Morin, and he then did a drawing of the Grand Chasse, and he didn't point out where the different items were. So there's 21 different relics, more or less held in this reliquary, and one of them is supposedly the head of Saint Peter or whatever, and so you can see a couple of things here. This one actually has them labeled, and these labels kind of talk about what may have been in there, and in particular, this one says down here, the holy towel in a table, and I can't quite read it all, but a holy towel in a table. So if you look at this box, it has hinges on it, and it looks like it may have an opening here, or maybe not, because this one is mounted on top of it. But so there's something inside of this inside of this reliquary box, and it says the holy towel inside a table. So there's something in a tablet or whatever that's inside there. And then there's all these other ones. There's the milk of the Virgin Mary. There's there in one of them there's supposed to be the head of somebody. They're the arm of somebody. Then there's the cloth. There's the all kinds of cool stuff. Okay, so now I think I showed you a couple of these pictures, but it's also kind of interesting how these images kind of evolved, and is also now another line of evidence for me as to whether the Mandylion or the Shroud are one and the same. But any questions in the meantime before I go on to this?
No, no questions from the audience or anything like that. But I think you've captivated them for once. There's no bickering going on with Ragnar or anything like that. I think they're just interested in what you're presenting. I just wanted to add a comment though about the origin of the Pantocrator image, because I apparently it's kind of contrasting Jesus with the emperor who was the autocrator or something. So by saying Jesus is Pantocrator, the meaning is he's even further. He's like the super emperor. He's even above the autocrator, who is the emperor or something. So I just wanted
Yeah.
to contribute that basic historical interest knowledge there, because I thought it was interesting. But yeah,
Yeah. Oh, that is very interesting. I hadn't heard that one, but thank you. So Christ, and I don't know how to pronounce it. Pantocrator, Pantocrator. But anyway, Pan means all, and
yeah.
so what this translates into Christ Almighty, Christ Almighty,
Now,
and
we did get a question actually just pop up from the audience here. So, I fish in a tie. He's saying, "Have you ever looked at the haplogroups on the Turin Shroud? It has the haplogroup K1A, 1B, 1A, which is also the same haplogroup of Mary Magdalene's hair in France." Do you know what he's talking about?
Well, as I understand it, the haplogroups are trying to identify the blood and the components of the blood to see if they are what they are, first of all, and whether whether the blood is AB, positive or negative or whatever it is. Um, and interesting, if they are the same, that I hadn't heard, and I'll definitely look that up. Uh, um, but I'm not really a blood person. I think Aileen Vargas. She's a big into the blood, but I know enough to get things wrong. But as I understand it, the haplogroups have to have something to do with the blood. And very interesting point if they are the same as what's in the hair of Mother Mary.
Yeah, or sorry, Mary Magdalene's hair in France. He's
Oh,
saying it could be from Mary Magdalene, who helped
yeah,
with burial, and that's how
yeah,
it's
right.
in the shroud. So Yeah.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's funny in the Grand Chas, they have what they believe to be, Mary's the milk of Mother Mary, and so they have a handful of different things, which who knows whether they're true or not. And that's part of the challenge here is they have some things where they potentially could do some testing maybe on these haplogroups. I do know, when if you're looking at DNA, the challenge with DNA is unfortunately that it's degraded to an extent and polluted to an extent by everybody else touching the shroud. The shroud is not like the relics or the artifacts found in with the mummies. With the mummies, those tombs were closed for 3, 4, 5,000 years, so they were not polluted by people touching them and corrupted by people touching them. The shroud was more or less open, and people were handling it left and right, repairing it, and so it is. It has a lot of uh, different items, different blood on it, different DNA on it, and so that's one of the challenges with trying to do some of those blood and DNA kind of tests.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. That's it for the
Yeah.
question. So I'll let you
Yeah,
continue on.
thank you for the question. Appreciate that. Perfect. Okay, so this is probably so. There's a guy named Vignon, and in the early 1900s, after the Secunda Pio did his black and white image of Christ, and really the scientific revolution in studying the shroud took place. And he came up with about 37 different measures of different items, that dimensions that you can find on the shroud, that are also found on many of the different images. So on the Christ Pantocrator, this image right here in the Cefalu Cathedral in Palermo, Italy, so the southern part of Italy, is the highest scoring of all of the images, and what Vignon did. Now, he didn't do a scoring. I brought the scoring together and trying to identify that. Now, of course, my scoring is certainly subjective. I am biased, no question about it. But you can see a handful of things here. First of all, you can see this line on the neck. You can see the notch in the beard. You can see the philtrum. There's a little black thing for the philtrum. You can see the long nose. You can see the V between the eyes. You can see these kind of googly eye kinds of things. You can see then one side is more bruised or than the other side, and then have this hair, little tuft of hair here, and you have a part in the head, and you have then this side over here of hair in this hair tress is longer on the one side than the other. All of those elements are some of the 37 that he identified, and so you can go along and you can score these images based on how many they have, how many they don't have, and then then you could say, well, this one here, because it scored so high, the artist that did this particular mosaic, he then must have had somehow access to the shroud, and he didn't reference an earlier work. Oh, well, he may have, but he didn't use that as his sole reference, because he has new markings on here that are from the shroud directly and not from the previous images. And so that's a really important thing as well. And then lastly, the age of this corresponds with those references we were talking about earlier on, being in the middle of the 1100s here. So anyway, the Christ Pantocrator, I've done then looked at not only the Christ Pantocrator ones. There's also the Alpha and Omega, I call them. So here, this has the ICXC, which is the abbreviation for Jesus Christ, and then you can see his fingers, the ICXC. So he's making in his hands the abbreviation for ICXC. So I for J, for the kind of the I in Jesus. C for the S in Jesus at the end of the word, X for Christ, and then S for Christus. So so ICSC, so ICXC, and that's kind of what he's trying to show here in his hand. And actually, when you go to Europe, and even in the US, you'll see images. Most of the US images are like this, where they have the two fingers up and the two fingers down. But the real way to do it is the ICXC, so ICXC, and then you can see the abbreviation up here. So just a cool little thing there. Now, so there's this image. Now, what I did was these. I wanted to then take this image, and I've got a whole series of these in another book that I'm writing, which studies about 50 different images, and then we have images that are labeled Mandylion. So these are actually, they call them, the Holy Mandylion, or and they're in the East. All of these images are in the East, and what's fascinating about these is that they also start about the middle of the 1100s, and they follow a lot of the markings that are on the shroud. Whereas if we go to that Anka icon, we could see that those images do not follow the markings that are on the shroud. So one hypothesis that I have is that the Holy Mandylion, or the Anka icon in that series of images, is using a different prototype, which is the Mandylion facial image, not the Shroud facial image. If you look at all of these, each one of these images are using the Shroud as its prototype. You can see the split in the beard, the longer hair on the left, on his left versus the right. You can sometimes see the part and the tuft of hair and other things. So there's the tuft of hair, and what have you. And then what's interesting too is on the cloth, this cloth image has then kind of the pins or the nails that were otherwise very similar to what was in the skylitzes. And so you can see these as in the West, in the East, Moscow. I don't know where this Pskov is in Russia. This one happens to be in France, Notre Dame de Leon, Turkey, Cyprus. These are kind of in the Greek part, so the Orthodox part of Greece, Russia, Novgorod, Bulgaria, Crete, Serbia, Russia. And so it's kind of fascinating that the East then has a different look at what the images are. It has the curls and the tresses, as opposed to over here. This one is more kind of influenced from both sides a little bit. So it's got some of the stuff, that line that I pointed out in that Skylitz image, and then it's got just the face. And all of these have just the face, whereas the Pantocrator images have the full body with the hand. So, yeah, I'm not going to go through that. So I did a whole scoring mechanism, and that, kind of, looks at pre 944, scoring. So 25 points versus after the 944, about 54. So a lot higher points and weightings. And otherwise, then I'm going to leave it there.
So, sorry, just a quick question about the points. So, like, what does that mean? Like, 25 points,
Yeah.
meaning that the images are based on the shroud. So you're saying it's kind of low, or what is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So prior to 944, those Mandylion images that are here on this previous slide, um, that then says that of the 37 Vignon markings, and then I also added two, so of a total of 39, the images kind of score a 25 out of 100. So if I had all 39 and I didn't have anything wrong, so left and right being correct and other things, so there's a couple of negatives in here in the scoring mechanism, that this scores roughly 25 out of 100, as opposed to after 944 about 54, which is kind of interesting. It kind of says that after 944, maybe then the Mandylion, is the Shroud, because the scores go up right after that once it shows up in Constantinople.
Yeah, that is a very interesting correlation. I'm thinking about it from Jack Markworth's image of God incarnate hypothesis, and I guess it could still be consistent with that because the arrival of the image of Edessa or the Mandyline in 944 would have changed things. Like maybe okay, they would have
Yeah.
realized. So yeah, I wonder how Jack. I'm probably going to ask Jack when he comes on my show in April how he'd respond to your scoring system here because it is a very interesting correlation. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think, and it's definitely a new path to take because you are normally a historian would only look at the written stuff. They wouldn't necessarily look at the imagery. Now, unfortunately, the iconoclasm, destroyed a lot of images in the West, in the East. And so, unfortunately, there was probably hundreds of images that are Pantocrator images that are now gone. Jack has seen a lot of the early work that I've had on here, so so certainly he can talk about whatever, and so he's familiar with it. I have based a lot of my research on a lot of his theories because I think he has some really strong theories and evidence, really strong evidence behind it
have
as to
you? Oh, sorry.
no, 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 go ahead.
Have you asked him about this point, this correlation in the point thing specifically? Because I would be interested in what he said about that.
I didn't get a chance to talk to him specifically about it because it was pretty early on, but he did give some general comments and really helped out. He is a master. I mean, I bow to him in the work and the evidence and he basically taught me how to do the historical evidence. And so his stuff, his work is just absolutely awesome.
All right, awesome. All right, cool. So, other than that, we do have another audience question. It's unrelated to. Oh, okay. Are you sorry if you've got
No, no,
more?
no. I'm just going trying to find the last slide here.
All right. So, once again, I fish in a tie. He said this is his question. Professor Robert Allen, I think he means Nicholas Allen, has convinced many people that he can recreate the image of the shroud using a lens. So he's talking about the protophoto or the camera obscura method.
Yeah.
How do you combat his argument?
Um, uh, Yeah, I think, and I haven't looked at that in a long time, but as I recall, it requires you to have I guess I don't know if you would do the image on the cloth first, and then you'd have to have a body as the prototype of the or not as the what you're taking the picture of, and then you have the image of obscura inside a dark room, and then through the lens it imprints on there. I remember Barry Schwartz talking about the image obscura method, and he says, well, the only way that you can get an image to appear on a cloth is to use silver. So all photographic film has silver in it. And so if the image obscura was the method, then there would have had to have been some silver on the cloth. And there is no silver on the cloth. There's no silver whatsoever on the cloth. But if you look at film or whatever, it all has silver in it because that's what then with light then captures the light in the image and turns it into the image for you. So that's one thing. The second thing is all of the other points. So you have where did he get the pollen from? Okay, where did he get the blood from? How did he put the blood on the cloth first? How did he get all of that other stuff that you think about with the proofs of the shroud and the evidence that's on the shroud, the photographer, and usually that photographer, that image obscura photographer, is thought of as being in the 13th, 14th century. How did he get the travertine aragonite dust from from Jerusalem? How did he know that he had to get the different pollens and stuff like that? So all of those other arguments kind of also come into play in addition to the argument of the silver. And I think Ian Wilson also in his book he talks about that, and I haven't looked at it recently, so I can't. Other than what I've told you, I can't remember the other arguments that associate with that image obscura method.
Yeah, yeah, and just so you know, I fish. So he says thank you for your answer there, Guy. And if you
Yeah.
do want additional details, so I have a show on my Real Seekers in the Shroud Wars playlist with Barry Schwartz entitled "What We Know for Sure About the Shroud Images," where he gives a detailed critique of the protophoto hypothesis of Nicholas Allen, along with other theories and why they fail. I also have my own solo show where I did a detailed critique of Nicholas Allen's image forming mechanism, and I refuted it in great detail as to why it can't reproduce several of what I call the minimal relevant features. So,
Mm.
those physical and chemical properties of the shroud. So, um,
Yep. Yep. And the 3D, just remember that one as well. The 3D characteristics.
yeah, yeah, it fails. It fails on so many fronts.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
superficial. They're not uniform
Yeah.
images.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, what I like about though that theory is that as different people come up with different theories, the science of the study of the shroud, the syndenology, is able to refute them in pretty strong ways. And so and it keeps as you get more arrows, you keep fending off these arrows, and it just kind of continues to further buttress the hypothesis that the shroud is the true burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And so, I think it's great that people come up with new theories, and that helps us shroudists to kind of come up with arguments to better our arguments to prove, not prove, but to provide evidence for that hypothesis that this is the burial cloth of Jesus.
yeah. And what one last thing on this that I'll just mention, because I see you mentioned you don't like him, by the way, kind of thing. So I guess he rubbed you the wrong way when he was on the History Valley podcast and that sort of thing. And I will just say, because Nicholas Allen, I do consider him sort of a personal online friend. I met the way we
Hmm.
met. He was threatening to sue me for the video I made refuting his theory, but after we kind of worked out that thing, and he realized I was being sincere and that sort of thing, we kind of became friends. And I think he is a nice guy personally. He's willing
Okay. Yeah.
he's willing to like send out books for free if you're interested and stuff like that. But yeah, his theory I really don't think works and that sort
Yeah.
of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
it's not like I don't know of him. I actually, I actually, never heard of his name up until right now. I mean, I know of and I may have read about it, but I didn't associate it with that name. So,
yeah, Nick, yeah. Like I said, yeah, Nick supposed to be Nicholas Allen, not Robert Allen there. But yeah, fair
okay.
enough.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thanks for that question. That's a good one. It keeps it's funny how you study all of this stuff, and I don't know if for the last 2 years I've been so focused on this one question here, and you kind of forget all of the facts that you knew before, because you don't get exposed to them as often as you'd like to. So fantastic.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, I think as far as I can see, that's it in the comments. There's nothing, no other audience questions and stuff. So
Okay.
yeah, yeah. I just want to say thank you very much. Obviously, this was meant to be your part 4 your grand finale on
Yeah.
your case.
Yeah.
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 Do you have any kind of closing words for the audience? Do you want to kind of bring all the threads of all four of the
Yeah.
questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. So what I've been so I've got all of this evidence, and, all of the images and all of the writings over the last 2,000 years, and from that, then I kind of have been developing hypotheses as to what happened. So my first thing is that most likely Apgar early on did write a letter, did send an envoy to Jesus. Jesus penned a letter back, but there was no image. There was either no miraculous image, or there was only a painted image. Now, I don't think there was a painted image either, although that one I'd say is maybe 50-50, given the early evidence. Then in 544, the city of Edessa was under siege from the Persians, and they had to do something. And they came up with a miraculously crafted image, and they marched it around and prayed with it. And I think that is when the image got. This is my kind of theory, and it's not 100%. Of course, nothing is, but maybe 70% is. Then that is when the image was created, and there were several copies. And the king of Persia wanted to buy the original image, and so then that's when the copies were made, and then they never gave them to him. But that's when now there are three. I think those two copies ended up now in Genoa, which was the one of the images I showed, and then the other one is in Rome in the Vatican, in the San Silvestri. All right, so that's now 544. Now we have a man-made image, which is being touted as a miraculous image to get the Persians to break their siege and run off. And supposedly they ran off. Edessa was not conquered, and they survived to live another day. Then the image stays there. It's not really brought out at all. And who knows why it wasn't. There weren't that many. This image was not now. This man-made image was not brought out until 944, when finally the emperor said, "Hey, I want all these relics. I'm going to send my army over, and I'm going to pay for them, but I'm going to send my army over to make sure I get it." Now, in parallel to that, the real challenge, though, is where was the shroud? And this is actually Jack's question, which is Jack Marquardt's question, which is a great one, is where was the shroud? So he kind of says that it was in Antioch early on, and then it went up to Constantinople, maybe in the 500s, and which is possible, and it, certainly pretty good. There are some images, some mosaics, as well as marble inlay that reflect some of the, not all of them, but some of the Vignon markings, and they start actually in 395 AD. Well, how did those get created if the shroud were in Edessa? And so somebody must have had access to the shroud starting in 395. An artisan must have had access to it, and it was pretty crude, but it had a handful of markings that you could say reflect the face of the man in the shroud. And then those images got better and better as the artisans learned from everybody else, and then the shroud is now in Constantinople. It's now more open because they have both the Mandylion and the shroud. And then 1244, 1204 with the Fourth Crusade. Everything is in chaos. The Mandylion now is luckily not destroyed or taken, and then it's now sent over up to Paris. Oh, by the way, and I forgot to mention, the part of the shroud that was referenced in all of those inventories was not a part of the shroud. It was thought to be a part of the shroud, but it was not. And the reason why I say that is primarily that the weave on the shroud is a 3/1 herringbone, looks like a chevron, whereas the weave on that part of the shroud is kind of an XY, whatever that one's called, a 1/1. And that piece was sold down to Spain, to Madrid, as I recall. And so that piece still exists, and so you can see it, and you can see that it's clearly not the same kind of material that you find on the shroud, which is the 3/1 herringbone. And so that piece of the shroud, that item 16 that I went through, is not the shroud. And so that's kind of another thing that says, well, even that piece of the shroud was wrong. Now, who knows what it was? Maybe wasn't part of the shroud, or maybe it was from a different cloth. Maybe it was from one of the, a linen cloth that was one of the cloths, the Athonia, as mentioned in the Bible. In any case, then so that's kind of what I kind of see as the what may have happened with the Mandylion, and then the Mandylion in 1793 unfortunately was destroyed in the French Revolution, and so there's no way we can test it or anything like that.
All right, awesome. Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much again. I hope you enjoyed your time coming on the show. To I think this was your first time presenting a series
Yeah.
on a topic and stuff. Yeah. How did you find it? Did you enjoy it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for letting me do it. It's funny. What I've found, and I've done a lot of teaching, over the years, and when you teach something or when you present something like this, you all of the tiny little nuances come to fore where you go, I need to express that better, or that's maybe not quite right, or whatever. And so it's very helpful to talk through this and then capture all of those little points as I'm putting them into the book and going from there. So yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Very valuable. Really appreciate it.
Awesome, awesome. All right, cool. Well, yeah, I think that does it for that. And I do want to thank you. I found your presentation to be very fascinating and that sort of thing. Okay, so okay, all right. Yep. So I fish. You're saying, don't forget, we're supposed to talk about the Telpiot tomb sometime. So that's correct. Yep. I will reach out to you. I think sometime in April is what I said. Later on in April or something, and we'll schedule that show. But for right now, I just want to once again conclude out and say, Guy, you did a great job on your end. I learned a heck of a lot through this series,
Thank you.
even stuff I'd never heard of. Despite knowing Ian Wilson and knowing Jack Markward, I think you have contributed to the our knowledge of Shroud history here and added some unique, interesting arguments and stuff. So,
Well, it's funny. You try and write a book, and you're supposed to be between 70,000 and 100,000 words, and with all the images and everything, I'm way past that. So it's going to be a tome. It's not just going to be a little thing. It's going to be a tome, and I don't know if I'm going to sell it or whatever because it's really just a paper. It's not a book that somebody's going to read. But certainly in a book format is the way to do it. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
no problem. So, all right. So yeah,
All right.
just so you guys know briefly what I have a couple shows tomorrow. One with Owen McDonald. So he reached out to me. He's basically a liberal, and he saw my show with Jamie Castro and Andrew Loomis, arguing that Christianity is more consistent with the right wing politically. And Owen said, "Hey, that's not fair. I think Christianity is more in tune with the political left." So he wants to give his case. So that'll be a show I have coming up tomorrow. So other than that, take care and have a great
Fantastic.
week.
Yeah, thank you, Dale. Really appreciate it. That's wonderful. Thanks for having me on.
All right. God bless everybody.